It is official. This is the pure Summoner Necromancer build that you've been waiting for. No Shadow Package, no Mendeln, no lucky hit procs, just pure, unadulterated, undead bones stabbing themselves into monsters until they explode. Now, I have to apologize to you immediately. That is in fact not what this video guide is. It is not what you are going to be finding here, because it turns out minions are absolutely still trash tier monsters. Now, there are plenty of things that you can do with your minions so that they will become good. Builds which are actually utilizing things like Ring of Mendeln and a giant shadow package to be able to buff them in significant ways. Even in those scenarios, your minions are not the ones doing the damage. Your minions are not the ones that are good. The Golem is actually doing pretty respectable damage in this season. He's actually doing fairly well, and buffing up your Golem can get pretty decent results. But in fact, in the video footage that you're currently watching, more than 50% of our total damage package is actually coming from our Seneschal Companion. Yeah, it turns out that if you take your minion and give it 100% of your stats, and then give it a ton of abilities that have cooldowns and deal a significant amount of damage with piercing projectiles that all do AoE, you can actually have a minion that successfully does damage on the base of its own merit. Whereas the Necromancer minions continue to suffer from only receiving 30% of your total stats, half of them not even translating very well, on top of being so incredibly squishy that it requires an entire Paragon system and a full survivability kit on your gear for them to be able to stand a chance in any high tier Nightmare Dungeon scenarios, including Nightmare Dungeon vaults, while simultaneously continuing to completely hamstring the actual damage output of the Necromancer themselves and the survivability of the Necromancer themselves, forcing you to use subpar, suboptimal, or just inefficient systems for keeping yourself alive just to give your minions enough time to be able to stack on their pitiful damage. Now, what I also want to show you right here, because some of the criticisms that my videos covering minions in the past have received is that I didn't do it right. So let me describe to you what I wanted to do with these minions so that you don't have to throw on the adages of what about this, what about this, what about this. I wanted to create a pure Summoner Necromancer. And let's just go ahead and define what pure Summoner is. When you have a pure build in a video game, typically the word that follows after that is a descriptor of a system that's meant to be the primary way that your build does damage. When I say I have a pure bone build, nobody is confused by what I mean. I either have Bone Spirit or Bone Spear or some kind of cool Bone Storm build where I'm using Ossified Essence, my key passive, which defines a pure build. When I say pure blood, there's actually a little bit of confusion there, but I typically either mean Blood Surge, Blood Lance, Keck W Blood Wave, or a combination of Blood Lance and Blood Surge for density clearing as well as single target damage. But nobody is confused as to what key passive I'm going to use. That's going to be Rathma's Vigor. When I say a pure darkness build, we actually have a ton of these, but we're either talking about Blight, Corpse Explosion, Sever, some combination of the three of these, Infinimist, X-Falls Ring, and we all know what key passive we're going to be using, and that's Shadow Blight. So when I'm talking about a pure summoner build, I want to use the Summoner Key passive, Kalan's Edict. Every skill point that I put in wants to be empowering the summons even further. The entire ultimate passive tree here for summons, golems here, mages here, warriors here. I'm not using any ridiculous combination of skills to be able to buff them even further. No, no, no. I want them to stand on the merit of their own 2 feet, and I want them to do the damage. We might toss in a little bit of spiked armor here or there. We might scale some damage based off of us applying curses and the like, but it's their damage that I want to be killing the monsters and to be carrying the build forward, leading to its survivability and its ability to competently clear content. And I mean a full investment into our summons. We're going to be using Mage to increase their damage and overall survivability, picking up almost every single node in the cult leader board, except for this topmost one, which you actually don't need for their survivability when you build into them properly. So that's why you're just going to see like the majority of people skipping this. But every other node in this board, including Dead Razor, to further push their damage reduction and their damage even further. Then we're going to follow that up by going into every single node in the hulking board, except for this one in the top, which gives us damage while our golem is active, which would give them then 30% of that damage. But going even further into Flesh Eater to be able to pick up Amplify, which is going to give us even more stats to pass on to them, and also increasing their damage whenever we curse something. Flesh Eater to give us another damage boost, which they get 30% of. And then lastly, building into Warriors here to buff their damage up and their survivability, and then Scent of Death to give us even half a chance of being able to survive damage once we're near them. But I mean a full investment into summons here. And let's go ahead and look at the gear too, because I know you're going to be thinking, well, the gear is probably bad. That's what's probably leading to this. I think that our gear, while not perfect, is just about what you would expect on any Necro Summoner build to make it viable. A massive two-handed scythe with a huge intelligence and all stats roll, additional crit damage to scale their damage, and then additional additive damage since we're applying stuns all of the time with life on kill to help keep them up and 2 more skulls on top of that. Obviously, we're using Blood Getters with even more survivability for us, Decrepify to further increase the survivability for them as well as us, slowing monsters down, CCing them harder. A big chest piece that has thorns, damage reduction, armor, maximum minion life, and with a might aspect to give us even a bare chance of surviving, because I'll just go ahead and let you in on this one. It was real hard to survive on the Necromancer when half of your stats are going to keeping them up. Occult for the additional mages, huge intelligence and all stats roll, more attack speed to push them even further, more crit chance to push them even further. Like ridiculous pants. Total armor, maximum life, damage reduction from close, Bone Storm for additional survivability, Flicker Step to help keep Bone Storm up, as well as giving us even more damage reduction from close. We have a ridiculous amulet. We don't even have mobility on this build. We just have minion attack speed, more total armor, more damage reduction, and +3 ranks to Hellbent Commander with Frenzied Dead. All of our rolls are perfect as well. Like, I didn't touch on that, but like perfect reanimation, perfect Frenzied Dead, perfect Shielding Storm, perfect might, etc. A huge ring, perfect roll Grasping Veins with crit chance, damage to close, maximum minion life, and maximum life here, giving us survivability, giving them survivability, giving them more additive damage, more chance to crit, and then another ring very similar. Crit chance, crit damage, vulnerable, damage to close. You may notice I have a duplicate of reanimation. I actually originally had conceded here, because I am going to swap out this gear to show you something slightly different, but I originally had conceded here because we should theoretically have permanent uptime on barrier. That gives us 25% damage, which gives them 30% of it. When I'm talking about fully investing in these minions, I mean every single stat that could be relevant to them and actually give us a fighting chance of staying alive. And they're still trash. They're hot garbage. They don't do anything. But you know what? I hear you. Mac, you're literally not using the right ultimate skill. This is a pure summon build. Not only do you need to be using Kalan's Edict, the summoner key passive, but you need to be using the summoner ultimate skill. That'll get you there. That gets you the damage, their survivability, their attack speed, gets you the corpses. That's what's going to do it. Okay, let's try it out. So one of the biggest benefits to Bone Storm, obviously, is the fact that you're able to stack on a huge amount of near infinite barrier generation, as well as gaining you 15% damage reduction, and then another 20% chance to crit. That's going to get your minions 30% of that, so you're going to be sitting on a whopping additional 6% chance to crit. One of the few ways of scaling their damage outside of vulnerable, which we already have on the build. Now we have to answer the question, how are we going to survive without that additional damage reduction and without that additional barrier? Well, initially, what was proposed to me was using the Seneschal. The Seneschal has Reconstruct, which will be healing you permanently if you also put on Duration and then also put on cooldown reduction, and then you can use that and put on damage reduction. So now Reconstruct theoretically should be healing you the entirety of the time and also be giving you back that damage reduction that you lost. It's not barrier, but it's effective damage mitigation. So you should be able to get up close and personal and not worry about dying. Sadly, that's just not the case. Well, at least it's not the case if you want to use any other skill and if you're not actively taking damage the entire time. Reconstruct will only trigger if you have been dealt damage. If you're at max life, you will not have it. And what that means is that you actually do not have the damage reduction until you're already in a scenario where you're actively taking damage. The other problem with it is that the Seneschal will choose to do its attack on every single instance that it can. It will choose to continuously attack in that way. So if you're not taking damage, or if you are taking damage but it's choosing to use its attack, there's going to be a lag time before it chooses to actively heal you. Because of that, we actually just throw on another survivability option, the ability for it to generate barrier on us. Sadly, we are already using duration and cooldown reduction somewhere else, so all we can really do when we add on barrier to the kit is make it so that your Seneschal will teleport to you, so at least keeps you within range, so if you start taking damage, there's a good chance that it'll start healing you. Throwing on Fortify, so at least you'll get that damage reduction if you ever manage to reach enough Fortify, and if you're using Reapers, you can also use Necrotic Carapace, so this is like not the worst option to have a really suboptimal 10% additional damage reduction. But then it turns out that there are literally no other stones that you can put on it if you're using 2 different cooldown supports. I just throw on Voluminous because it says that it works, I just don't know what it does. And with all of that in place, we were surviving. We still had to stay back because we had no proactive damage reduction. We still had to completely rely on crowd control, and we were continuing to see the issue where the only damage legitimately being dealt was from our Golem. It turns out that adding on another 100% increased attack speed, and then the damage boost that they'll get from that with Cult Leader, takes the 0 damage that your skeletons are doing, multiplies it by a whole bunch of additional multipliers, and ends up at 0 again. Luckily, the Golem is doing more damage. They're able to output more damage. And then all of your monsters attacking more quickly helps with cooldown reduction. So you're able to spam your Golem's ability that much faster. But going further and further into this vault, you'll notice that we're still not ever really getting healed or the damage reduction bonus from our Seneschal. And it really just seems like using these 2 things in concert isn't actually doing anything. So we'll move the good stones over to the barrier, and then we're actually going to add damage back onto our Seneschal. Firefly, piercing, multi-shot, and then we can also throw on Frigid to add on a little bit more crowd control and eventually freeze monsters as well. This would also help with staggering bosses if you ever did any content where you have to fight bosses again. And lo and behold, all of a sudden our build is doing significantly more damage. We haven't resolved our survivability issues at all. We're still hanging completely back, but the Seneschal sure is doing damage for us, and that's pretty cool. Now, there are a lot of different things that you could do to make it so that Unyielding Commander and by proxy Army of the Dead is up more often. You could throw Flicker Step back onto this build and then just move your additional mages up onto your gloves, because it turns out that Grasping Veins doesn't really translate to a good amount of damage unless you're using Ring of Mendeln. So you can actually just get rid of that and it frees up the slot. You could also move around where these aspects are. Obviously, Unyielding Commander can make its way back down to the 2-hander, Reanimation can make its way back up onto the Amulet, and then Frenzy Dead, which is much less important with Unyielding Commander, can move its way back down to your ring slot. But the moment that you have Unyielding Commander at a double the total bonus of its increased attack speed, all of a sudden it really starts to beg the question, why am I using a conditional 30% increased attack speed here when Unyielding Commander is basically doing all of that for us? Now, Shadow Summoner, on the other hand, is a phenomenally powerful build, and as you can see in the video footage right now, it just like vastly outperforms anything that you could do with Kalan's Edict or Army of the Dead. But you might notice something a little bit interesting here in the footage as it rolls by, and that's that I just dropped the skeletons in their entirety. They just legitimately are not actually performing any key role function on the build. Their damage is completely useless, their functionality is completely useless, and even their utility, which is actually fairly good for leveling. On certain builds, you can use them in different circumstances for being able to generate essence, and a little bit of corpses if Reapers weren't bugged and only generating 1/10 of the corpses that they're supposed to be. But, you know, that's a bug I've already reported. What can we do there? But here is the wildest part about the footage that you're watching right now, because you probably assume I completely respect over to like a full corpse explosion version of the build, redid everything just to really highlight how strong the individual Golem, the individual Seneschal, and then the addition of this Shadowblight package is. But luckily, I have the benefits of editing and being able to create a narrative to drag you along. I just turned off my skeletons. I went and sacrificed Reapers, I went and sacrificed Cold Mages. I didn't remove their aspects from my build. I didn't change anything about the stats that I have on my build. Still have maximum life and thorns right here. We're still using Frenzied Dead, ultimately only for our Golem at this point. Still using Reanimation, also ultimately just for the Golem at this point. I did put on a Ring of Sacrilegious Soul, and actually kind of didn't even really like it. Actually helps out a lot more on your minions than it does on this build because it kept eating up my corpses when I didn't want it to. But by throwing on Ultimate Shadow so that our Bone Storm can continue to generate additional barrier and be able to take up Shadowblight, putting Shadowblight on your weapon, and then adding on a Lidless Wall, which ultimately doesn't really help except until the kill room where you're able to spread around the Bone Storms more efficiently. But everything else I left the exact same. Even my Paragon board is the exact same. I'm still running warriors here. Still running mages here. I'm still fully built into Cult Leader for no reason. I just wanted to prove this point. How is it that with the same Paragon and turning off my minions, the same aspects and turning off my minions, and then admittedly with a quick swap over from the minion masteries over to the damage for our Shadow, putting a couple extra points into Corpse Explosion, but not even quite maxing it out with all the different stats that we could have on our gear, and just simply swapping over to Shadowblight, leaving everything else the exact same with Hellblink Commander, which is ultimately completely trash, but like, what can you do? Still investing in Golem Mastery, etc. It's just strictly better. It's strictly better by every metric. It's faster, it's safer, it does more damage. You're actually able to use a Seneschal that's able to output damage as well, with the Firefly being able to add on a ton here, being able to swap back over to Flash of Adrenaline since our survivability is handled by a skill that literally just says you are now surviving until this runs out. And you have a good minion build. The Golem is a good minion. Your Seneschal is a fantastic minion. But I really just want to include this as well in the video to highlight how drastically different the effectiveness of any other skill that you could put on your skill bar is in comparison to your skeletons. I didn't even set out to remove the skeletons and pull this wool over your head. I was running the build with them instead of Reap, and I just kept running into issues where I couldn't choose to have a corpse. I wasn't able to proliferate bone storms as effectively as I wanted to. And it just turns out that waiting for my Reaper skeletons to generate a corpse, as opposed to just walking up and reaping and doing it myself, was that much less efficient to completely axing them from the build, ending up being a net benefit. So where does this lead us off vis-a-vis summons? The minion necromancer, the summoner necromancer that we all want, that pure summoner. It's still bad. It just is bad. Your Golem is actually in a really good place right now. And if you want to add your Golem to one of your builds, to be able to add as an additional tank, add on additional damage reduction from the Blood Golem, or even just slot in a huge amount of damage, throw Golem into the Hulking Monstrosity board, pick up the Legendary node, maybe do that at the end of your board so you don't have to worry about maxing out everything. But it turns out scaling the Necromancer's damage and scaling the Necromancer's survivability, as well as the Necromancer's utility, is going to continue to be the best way of building the Necromancer. See how that like weird caveat of having it describe it in that way is something that you don't have to do on any other class. You don't have to ask the rogue, hey, are you focusing on your damage and your damage reduction, your survivability and utility? They'd go, well, of course I am. I'm a rogue. Why wouldn't I do that? I go, oh, okay, cool. You don't ask the barbarian, hey, are you scaling your damage, or are you only scaling the proc damage from a ring that needs to be ridiculously applied by like one of your AoE effects? And they go, oh no, all 4 of these weapons right here are just making my charge do trillions of damage. It's like, okay, great. Good job, barbarian. But let me go ahead and like turn down the tone a little bit, because ultimately what this actually is a love letter to the developers. Please, 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 please. I hope that you are using the Seneschal Companion as like a really cool sneaky test for being able to figure out what the upper limits of minions would be if you were to have them scale with 100% of the Necromancer's stats. But I implore you, I know that we have the itemization changes coming in Season 4, and I imagine there's a lot that's already baked into that. But we have an entire 3-month period here, a little bit less obviously, where the Necromancer is going to continue to want to use their minions to good effect and continue to fail to do so. If the Seneschal Companion, with its ability to have a customized area of effect, piercing, damage over time ability that you can make taunt monsters, apply chill, apply poison that infinitely recursively loops on a bunch of monsters, is any indicator of how strong you could buff the Necromancer's skeletons that are swinging normal swords, scaling at like 10 to 15% of our weapon damage and doing no special attacks, could be, then I hope that you're taking a look at it. If the Necromancer skeletons bare minimum scaled at 100% of our stats, not only would it make the game more intuitive, make it easier for players to really grok how to amplify their damage and how to scale their build without needing to sacrifice multiple rolls on their gear to hopefully proc different Thorns effects or increase their survivability while ultimately making it so that the Necromancer, already one of the squishiest classes, goes even further down the totem pole of ability to survive without having to rely on Bone Storm and Shielding Storm. It would make the entirety of the experience so much better, so much more holistic, intuitive, and just strictly easier for you all to be able to scale and build upon later on as well. When I first played this game, all the way back when the closed beta was out, and I came out with one of my first videos, which was how fun and effective are the different Necromancer archetypes, I had minion builds in Keck W tier. Over the seasons, we continue to see the best minion builds ultimately be Shadow Summoner that's proccing X-Falls, Shadow Summoner that's proccing Mendeln, Shadow Summoner that's kind of just using them as utility, or finding the best avenues of proccing men down as often as possible, whether it's bugged Bone Prison, Bone Spear, or pre-nerf overstacking corpse explosions. What we have yet to get is a true summon Necromancer, an army of the dead commander. And I would really like to see that be different. So let me know down in the comments what you think. I know this one is a bit doom and gloom, a bit dreary, but I put a lot of time and effort on stream today coming up with what I thought would be the best pure summoner, so that we can really see what the extent of the buffs that they got this season were, and it fell short. Then we tried out Army of the Dead as well. Maybe there was some secret sauce in there that we weren't quite tapping into. Unyielding Commander was clearly the key, and that fell short as well. And then quite literally without intending to do it, trying to figure out a way to make my build more efficient, realized taking the skeletons off the skill bar was the only way to accomplish that. And I got a build that very quickly farmed it through this tier 100, not needing to stop continuously, fall back, avoid damage, move out of the way of AoE or CC. Nope, just stood in the middle of the kill room, gunned everything down, moved on and got my loot. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that ultimately it helps the community get a summoned necromancer that we can all be proud of. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.